come in. Yeah, so hello and a warm welcome to this session of this term's New Voices talk series on Émilie du Châtelet. And I'm so happy we've got Eszter Kovács here. She's been a member of New Voices for a long time, and she does excellent research on Émilie du Châtelet. And I'm just so happy that you're sharing your new findings with us today. Eszter is an assistant research fellow at the Research Institute for Politics and Government at the University of Public Service in Budapest, and she holds a master in French and in Hungarian and a PhD in French literature. She carried out studies in philosophy as a postdoctoral researcher in literature, and she was affiliated to the University of Châtelet. She's currently working on a PhD in philosophy, which is dedicated to early modern female conceptions of liberty. And her main research interests include Diderot, Montesquieu, Émilie du Châtelet, and Mary Astel. And I'm just handing over to you now, Eszter. I should say I'm recording the talk and not the discussion as always. So in the end, you shouldn't see yourself in the discussion afterwards. But yeah, we are recording the talk for everyone who maybe can't make it today. So today, Eszter is going to talk about Émilie du Châtelet, Lost in Transition, and about Émilie du Châtelet and the Encyclopédie.
Thank you very much, Clara, and thank you for all of you being here. And actually, I don't know what kind of a weather do you have. We have a very hot weather in Hungary, so it's just we have to be really pro to be here for working today. And I'll share my screen. Okay, so we have tried it. Okay, you can see it, I hope. Can you see it? Okay, and then I start the slideshow, and I hope it will go on. So you see the first slide normally. Okay, so the title is Lost in Translation, Émilie du Châtelet and the Encyclopédie. And of course, all of you know very well that there have been 2 articles about this topic, and I would like to present some new findings and also discuss the methods of these articles and of preliminary research about this topic, and to discuss methods that can help us to have new findings and more results. So Lost in Transition, I have chosen this title because lost in translation is a very well-known expression. And actually, as all of you know, that Émilie du Châtelet was largely used by the encyclopedists and by during the decades after her death by other authors and even in 19th century science, but they rarely name her when they use her works. So she just kind of lost in by transferring her ideas and her notions and conceptions. And first, I'd like to talk about preliminary research about the posterity of Émilie du Châtelet's philosophy. So Kofi Maglo in 2008 published an article on Émilie du Châtelet in the Encyclopédie of Diderot and D'Alembert. And this was the first article. And I will talk about the method he used for this article. And Glenroe published an article. It was officially published in 2018. It was already available online in 2017. It was a new article about the same subject with a different method and new findings. And Kofi Maglo and Glenroe together identified 13 articles or entries in the Encyclopédie of Diderot and D'Alembert in which foundations of physics were used. And I also have to mention the book of Véronique Leroux, published in 2019, which is entitled Émilie du Châtelet, Philosophe. And Véronique Leroux dedicates several chapters to du Châtelet's reception. And there is one of these chapters, a very interesting comparative study of the scientific method of D'Alembert and du Châtelet. I have to mention an ongoing project by Annelise Ray, who is currently preparing a critical edition of Foundations of Physics. And Annelise Ray also tries to prove that Émilie du Châtelet played a key role in the French resemantization of sciences after the Newtonian turn. So it was very important to create and to diffuse a new scientific and metaphysical and physical vocabulary. And my first work on this subject, it was about du Châtelet's conception of freedom. And I discovered that traces of du Châtelet's conception of freedom can be found in the Encyclopédie, in the article freedom, but in other articles as well. And the differences between methods is very interesting. So Coffey-Maglo analyzed the 7 articles in which Madame du Châtelet or Foundations of Physics or both were explicitly mentioned, and sometimes in an abbreviated form. So quite often, instead of finding Institution de Physique, we can find Institut de Physique in these articles. And there is something important that at that time, Coffey-Maglo could use the Chicago project. So there was already a digitalized version of the Encyclopédie with a research engine. So it was just necessary because there are 17 volumes, so you cannot find things without a research engine, or not so easily. So he analyzed 7 articles, and Glandreau, about 10 years later, identified 6 other articles containing longer borrowings from Foundations. And it is very important that these 6 articles do not refer to the author or the works. So Émilie du Châtelet or Foundations are never named. So while Maglo studied references, Glandreau used the digital method, which was based on sequence alignment, to detect quantitatively important borrowings. In the articles analyzed by Glandreau, it's something like 45 or 50% of the article or the entry is directly word for word or almost word for word borrowed from Foundations. And my first finding was accidental. It was just really an accident. I was working on Émilie du Châtelet's conception of freedom, and via a simple Google Books keyword research, I found that the entry God borrows verbatim du Châtelet's conception of divine freedom. So there is just 2 words are changed because God becomes the supreme being, and the choice of his will becomes the law of his will. So it's a very slight change. And of course, when we have a first accidental finding, then we can make the hypothesis that du Châtelet's concepts can be found in other articles than the 13 ones already identified by Maglo and Rowe. And what can help us to detect these entries? It's very interesting. Of course, after the Chicago project, there was a French project, which is called Encre. You may know this very well, which is a digital project about a digital edition, a digital critical edition of Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopédie. And it is a very good research engine, which makes it possible to carry out different researches or requests for keywords or for entire passages, and it's very useful. Of course, if we study du Châtelet's conceptual framework, it can help us because we can find that not only individual passages were borrowed, but the conceptual framework was borrowed. Classical distant reading with keywords is very useful because after the Encyclopédie, there were other encyclopedias which continued to borrow. So it continued until the end of the 18th and even until the beginning of the 19th century. One encyclopedia borrowed from the other, and it was in usage. I think that we can make further trials of digital tools, basically plagiarism scans, and case studies can be really interesting. My example is time. The concept time, because if we study time, we know that the entry temps comes, or a part of it comes from Foundations. And if we study the conceptual background or other entries linked to the entry time, then we can make other findings. But there is another interesting question, is that these digital methods have shortcomings. So we don't have to rely on them always, because they don't they can be deceptive sometimes, or we can miss things. So one of the shortcomings of these digital methods is that they do not detect short borrowings in long articles. That's the case of the article God, because the definition of divine freedom is borrowed from Foundations. It's something like 5 lines. It's a word-for-word borrowing, but it's a very long entry. So when there is a borrowing from Foundations, which takes up for 5 lines, and it's in an entry which takes up for several pages, then we cannot find it. Basically, digital methods cannot detect paraphrases if they are not so close, so distant paraphrases. There has to be a researcher who reads these things to detect borrowing, which is rather paraphrase. And if the syntactical order is reversed or confused, then digital methods can't find it. And they cannot detect a negative borrowing, for example, if we deny a thesis, or something that is ironical. So if there is an ironical reaction in a debate or an ironical reaction to an idea, we have to actually make a close reading of the text. And they do not make possible qualitative evaluation of the borrowings. So we have to think about it. It's not enough to find borrowings, but we have to think and judge them. And now there is a table. It's a summary. So these are results that are currently known. So the first column contains the entries with reference to the source. So these are the entries discovered by Kofi Maglo. So we can see it's continu, espace, hypothèse, mouvement, pesanteur, repos, temps. And these are in physics, in metaphysics. Basically, that's the case. And these are the entries that name du Châtelet or Foundations. The second column contains the 6 entries without reference, but with large, long borrowings. And these are continuité, contradiction, divisibilité, pendule, suffisante raison, and vitesse. So these are also in metaphysics, in physics, and in mechanics, which is part of physics. And the new results, which I don't include here, the debate about freedom. So these are the new results regarding metaphysics and physics. But nevertheless, as God is included in metaphysics, I included this finding here. So 5 articles: Dieu, impossible, possible, succession en philosophie, and uniform. And these are in metaphysics and mechanics. And then we will see, because the authorship attribution is quite important, some of these findings are anonymous articles. For example, possible et possibilité, it's an anonymous article. It was attributed to Diderot, but it was an erroneous attribution. And first, after this summary, or after this table, we have to make some general reflection about what we can know from these findings, or what we can deduce from these findings, or what we can state. So basically, we can state that there are numerous concepts defined already in Foundations of Physics, which are found again in the Encyclopédie. Several of the entries dedicated to these concepts contain borrowings from Foundations, sometimes word for word, sometimes in a less evident way. And seminal form plays a key mediating role. So when there is a borrowing in the Encyclopédie from Foundations, most often it's via formi, but not necessarily in articles which he wrote himself, because D'Alembert and Jaucourt and even used his writings to compose other entries. So these borrowings can be found in entries composed entirely or partly from his writings. And there is something very interesting about cross-references. This is what I discovered while working, is that if there is a borrowing from du Châtelet in an entry of the Encyclopédie, then we have to check cross-references, because there may be other borrowings in cross-references. I will give an example for this. This is the example, but later on, of the entry time and then succession, because succession is a cross-reference in the entry time, but we'll see it later more in detail. There are 3 interesting figures, and let's say that material side of the borrowing, they do not play the same role. These are Formy, D'Alembert, and Diderot. And as I have just said, if passages are taken word for word from foundations are found in the Encyclopédie, most often it comes via the mediation by Formy, because Formy actually copies foundations of physics, and D'Alembert and Jaucourt and sometimes Claude Yvon integrate Formy's text in their entries. So then there is a copy which has been which was integrated. D'Alembert actually never copies Émilie du Châtelet. So he often reconsiders the problem and often applies a similar method. But as far as I am aware, there is no direct copy. And we can discuss it later why it was not the case. And there is something which is a bit deceptive. It's that searching for du Châtelet's influence in entries written by Diderot is somewhat fruitless. And I will keep it for the discussion why it can be fruitless or why it was the case. I have a hypothesis about that, but we'll see together. And I have another table, which is a kind of summary or the analysis of some examples that is about the extent of the borrowing. Because, of course, borrowings can be very different. So the first column is the entry. The second column is the author, if we know the author. And the third column is about the type of borrowing. And the first example is the article Sufficient Reason, which is an anonymous article. We can suppose that it was also via Samuel Formy. And most of the article comes from foundations. So it basically means that foundations was so well known at this age for a very good definition and very good application of the principle of sufficient reason that the article is really based on what she wrote about it. The second article, it's interesting, it's the article Impossible in Metaphysics. It's also an anonymous article. And it has less borrowings because actually the article doesn't copy foundations, but it borrows two examples from foundations. And these two examples are examples for deceptive ideas. So what can we mean by deceptive ideas in this context? The article says, as already du Châtelet states in Foundations, that there is a Cartesian definition for the possible. It says that possible is the thing of which we can have a clear and distinct idea. And it is not always true because there are things of which we can have a clear and distinct idea, and nevertheless, these things can be impossible. And one of the examples come from Leibniz is that we cannot imagine the highest speed, because if there is a wheel that turns, of course, if the wheel is larger and the radium is larger, then it will turn more faster. And then we can imagine and always imagine a larger wheel, and it will always turn faster. So we cannot imagine the highest possible speed. And this is one of the two examples that are borrowed word for word in the article, which is not always based on du Châtelet's text, but the two examples are borrowed from it. There is a lower degree of borrowing, which is found in the article Possible et Possibilité, so about possibility. This is an anonymous article, and it was erroneously attributed to Diderot by the famous 19th century edition Assises à Tourneux, but these attributions are not always accepted nowadays. And there is only a paraphrase in this article. So there is no word for word borrowing, but there is a paraphrase. And this paraphrase of du Châtelet's ideas is that possibility cannot depend on God's will, because if it only depended on God's will and not on other thing, not on God's understanding, but on his pure will, then something would be possible at a moment and impossible another, and it would be a contradiction in terms. So something cannot be possible and impossible at the same time. So possibility depends on God's understanding and not his pure will. And there are four other articles that I have examined, attribut, essence, propriété, mode, and these contain very distant paraphrases. So we cannot actually textually prove that these are borrowings, because there is something that is like Du Châtelet's text, but it's so distant that it can be something rewritten by memory or rewritten by using someone else's ideas, but it's not textual evidence. So I have already mentioned the role of the cross-references, and I have a very interesting example here. So there is the concept succession, which is defined in Foundations, and it's in chapter 6 in paragraph 108. There is a general reflection about succession and time, and there are two examples. So the moon and the clock needle, these are examples to say that we cannot actually see succession when we look at the moon or when we look at a clock needle, because the the motion is too fast or too slow. And in the article time, there is a verbatim borrowing. And this is a passage part written for me. And the two examples, so the moon example and the clock needle examples are taken, but there is an explanation after these examples in Du Châtelet's text, and these are shortened in the entry time of the Encyclopédie. And this entry contains the cross-reference, which is succession. So the author refers to the entry succession. And if we look at succession, we find paraphrase of the same idea, so that succession comes from successive ideas and not motion, and it's a somehow confused paraphrase. I will show you in a minute. So it's a paraphrase, but it's not very, very well borrowed, if I can say this. So you can see here the French text, so the text from Foundations. Le mouvement est si loin de nous donner par lui-même l'idée de la durée, comme quelques philosophes l'ont prétendu, que nous n'acquérons même l'idée du mouvement que par la réflexion que nous faisons sur les idées successives, que le corps qui se meut excite dans notre esprit par son existence successive aux différents êtres qui l'environnent. Et comme vous pouvez voir, okay, I don't have to speak French, sorry. So as you can see, you can just see that it's almost the same. There is just one very slight change. It's just existence becomes coexistence. So it's a really textual evidence. And you can see the same idea, but somehow rewritten in the article succession. And there is something interesting. So you can see that in the original text, we can read, comme quelques philosophes l'ont prétendu. So as some philosophers have said. And in the entry succession, there is Locke there, written as L. So with Luke, and so the author of the article found it necessary to precise this reference, so not to say just as some philosophers have said or have thought, but to precise that it was about Locke. So we can see that there are textual borrowings with minor changes, and sometimes there are paraphrases. And before concluding, I would like to raise some further questions, which are very interesting, and I don't know the exact answer, so it will be very interesting to look at these questions during the discussion. So why is it fruitless, for example, to search for Du Châtelet's influence on Diderot's thought? Because we know that Diderot knew her, we know that Diderot knew her work, and nevertheless there is not such an evident influence on Diderot's thought. And is it because Diderot himself had an ambiguous relationship to Newton and Leibniz, or is it because D'Alembert edited entries in physics and in metaphysics, if the question was related to physics, and Diderot's role at the time was rather to work on entries in the history of philosophy? Because let's say that it's a possible answer that Diderot didn't really work at the time on entries in physics or metaphysics, if related to physics. But my hypothesis for the answer is that it may be Diderot's materialistic view of motion and the source of motion itself. It may be possible that he didn't really appreciate a theistic viewpoint that Émilie du Châtelet expresses on God as a first mover or as a first spiritual principle, but it's only a hypothesis, so we don't have to accept it. And as a very brief conclusion before the discussion, I would like to say that, of course, this is a research that, in my opinion, cannot be done by one researcher. So we have to continue, because du Châtelet's reception was very important. And we know that she was really, really used, even plagiarized. And those who plagiarized her don't refer to her or very often. And even there were authors who seem to despise her, then they use her. And I think that we can still have a lot of findings on the posterity of her philosophy and on her influence, which can really prove or confirm that she had a very important influence on the philosophy after the decades of her death. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Esther.